Hi and welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica and today we are going to be making this lovely lucky layer cake quilt using just one layer cake. So this quilt behind me is called the Lucky Layer Cake Quilt, and I've called it that because I used a layer cake to make it. If you're new to pre-cut fabric pieces, layer cakes are basically 10" by 10" squares. This particular pattern uses 36 layer cake pieces. So if you are purchasing a Moto layer cake, that's usually one layer cake. If you are using a different brand, just make sure that you see how many pieces are in there because you're going to need at least 36 10" by 10" squares. Of course, you can also use yardage. One thing that I like about layer cakes is that they're a sampling of a specific line of fabric, so you get a lot of different pieces in there and you can come up with something really fun like this beautiful quilt behind me. So before we jump into today's video, I just wanted to let you know the fabric that I'm using. So this fabric is called Nantucket Summer by Thimble Blossoms. It's a beautiful line full of blues and greens, very relaxed summer vibe, which I loved about it. I thought it was so pretty. This pattern is perfect for layer cakes. There's very little waste involved, although there will be a few little extra squares left over that would be perfect for a patchwork tote bag. In today's video, I am going to be showing you how to make one of these blocks. If you would like to make the entire quilt that you see here behind me, I will put a link on where you can get the full pattern down below this video. You can also go to my store at store.confessionsofahomeschooler.com and search for Lucky Layer Cake. All right, let's go ahead and get started with today's tutorial. So here is what our block is going to look like for this project. I'm going to show you how to cut out and assemble one block, but if I'm making this entire quilt, what I'll do is I'll actually cut all of my pieces out at the same time, and then I can mix and match my blocks so that I have different colors for all of the parts, and it just makes it a lot easier. So I always pre-cut all of my fabric when I'm preparing for an entire quilt. The other thing that I did was I went ahead and best pressed all of my fabric. So I took my yardage for my background, and I also took all of my layer cake pieces and I best pressed them. So all that means is I just spray them with best press. I just do a light spritzing. I don't fully saturate it, and then I just press it. I do have a video on how to do the best press. You can spray just one side and press it, which is what I did for these, or you can spray both sides and press it. That'll give you a little bit more thickness. These have a little bit more body than they originally did, but they're not super stiff. So it kind of depends on what you prefer, but I really do like using this product. As far as I've been able to tell, it does not shrink your fabric like normal starch would. So that's really nice. The other thing I like about this is if I change my mind and I say need to use a piece for my scraps, I can just spray it really quick and use it. Whereas if you are starching your fabric and you do all of your fabric before you start, it's kind of a pain to go back and just starch one tiny little piece. So that's pretty much it. You're going to need also just your basic sewing supplies. I've got my rotary trimmer, some pins. I've got a couple of acrylic rulers over here. You can use whatever you have. Let's go ahead and get started on cutting out some of our pieces. So I've already gone ahead and cut out my background pieces. So I have my A, B, and C fabrics ready to go. So I'm just going to set those aside. But I did want to show you how I'm cutting out my layer cake pieces. Now the pattern actually has instructions for cutting the whole quilt out. It tells you exactly what to cut from each of your layer cake pieces and how many of those you'll need. But I'm just going to be doing one block for you today. Now, a couple of tips I have for you on working with layer cake squares. They are not always 10 by 10, even though they say they are. So I don't know if you can tell here on my cutting board, but I've got my lines right here, and I've got a little bit of shrinkage here and a little bit of shrinkage here. Now, some of that might have been because I pressed it a little bit crooked when I was pressing these before I started. But one thing that you do want to do is still square up your layer cake squares. They just aren't always exactly 10 by 10. So just trust me on that. I did try and not trim anything one time. I made a patchwork quilt of 10 by 10 squares and they weren't all lining up and I couldn't figure out why. And this is why right here. So just be aware of that. So that's tip number one. Tip number two, and I get asked this question a lot, is how can you tell where to measure from? And let's put this on a piece, a blue cutting mat so you can see. Now, layer cake squares are cut with pinked edges. And so on our pinked edges, we've got the points of our pinked edge and the valley of our pink edge. And when you're cutting out a quilt, that's about 1/8 of an inch or so, a little bit less than that, but it can make a difference when you're cutting your pieces. So I actually like to square up my corners so I'm not having to deal with these, but if you do have to deal with these, if you are lining them up with, say, another piece, you actually measure from the point, the mountain part of your V, not the valley. So if I were to be lining this up on my ruler, I'm going to line the points up with the line on my ruler, not the valley. Hopefully that makes sense. It might actually be sort of hard to see, but the points of my fabric are lined up along my edge, not these little valleys. Okay, and that's how I know how to trim my layer cake squares. And you can use that method on any pre-cut that has those pinked edges. They all have pinked edges to keep them from fraying. And what you can also do if you just don't want to deal with them is just put your ruler right up along here, trim that edge off, and then you're dealing with a straight edge and you don't have to worry about the pinked edges. All right, let's go ahead and cut our first layer cake square. And this we're going to need an 8.5 inch square out of. My 8.5 inch edge is right here. So I'm going to just trim off these extra pieces, then I'll turn it around. These are a little bit small, so I'll probably toss those. These you can throw in your scrap bin. The other thing they're good for is if you donate to places that make dog beds, they stuff them with fabric scraps. I'm gonna go ahead and label this with an H, and then we're gonna grab our next piece. Again, I'm going to just make sure this far edge is straight. Now that I have a straight edge right here to work with, I'm going to go ahead and trim these down. So I'm going to first cut, I need 4 3.5 inch squares. So I'm going to cut at a 7, and this edge looks pretty straight, so I'm just going to leave it, and 7. And I'm just going to set these aside for just a sec. We are going to use those. And then for this, I can go ahead and trim it down now into 3.5 by 3.5. So there's one 3.5 cut. And if you don't move these around, there we go. Now we have 4 squares that are 3.5, so we can just set these aside. We're going to label those with our D. And then from our remainders, we need to cut a couple more squares. These are going to be our E squares. These are going to be our E squares. These are our corner sections, and these are going to be 2.5 by 2.5. And from here, we can go ahead and just cut these down to 2.5 inch squares. And so I'm going to just use my ruler here to cut a couple off, and I just do my best to line that edge up there so I can cut more than one at a time. This one's too small, so that can go in with our scraps. And we actually only need 4 out of this, but since I have this left and it's already the right size, I'm going to go ahead and just cut a couple extra. That way when I'm putting my quilt top together, I'll have a couple extra colors to choose from if I need it. Okay, so these can go in our scrap pile or our extras pile, or if you're making the whole quilt. And these are our E squares. All right, for this last one, we need 4 more 3.5 inch squares, and we need 3 smaller squares for our full-size quilt. So for this video, we'll discard those, but you'll see what I mean when I show you the finished quilt. So again, I'm gonna cut at 7. Okay, so now we have 4 more 3.5 inch squares, and these are going to be our F squares. And then for these, the extras that you cut off for this are actually for the full-size quilt. We're going to be cutting these down into 2-inch squares. And these, like I said, are actually corner posts for the full-size quilt. So you don't really need them in today's video, but since I'm cutting up my layer cake, I'm going to go ahead and just finish cutting the pieces that I need. Okay, so these I'm actually going to just set aside. These are for when I assemble my whole quilt. These are going to be the cornerstones for it, so we don't need that in today's video. So today we're just going to be making one block, but whenever I'm making an entire quilt, I always pre-cut all of my fabric so it's ready to go. And then whenever I have a few extra minutes, I can just pop into my sewing room and do a little bit of sewing. Now I cut all of these pieces out. Here are all of my little extras that I cut off. I cut them all into 2.5 inch squares, and I'm pretty sure there's enough here for me to make a bag. So I'm going to hang on to these and save them for another project. Okay, so here's all of our cutting. We're ready to go and we can start assembling. We're going to start off by taking our B square and our H square, and we're going to set these other ones aside. So for this project, we're going to be making 8 at a time half square triangles. Now, I did mention at the beginning to make sure you press your fabric with best press or starch it. That is because we're going to be cutting this on the bias, and so these are going to be getting kind of stretchy, and so you want your fabric to have a little stability. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it and place these 2 squares right sides together. This pattern actually has a little bit of extra wiggle room in it for trimming, so they don't have to be perfect. And we're going to draw a line from corner to corner on the wrong side of these B squares. I'm just using my friction erasable pen because this will come off with heat, but this is also in the seam allowance, so it's not actually going to matter. Now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch away on both sides of both diagonals. All right, so I've sewn on both sides of my lines and now we need to cut our block. And a little trick I have is before I trim this, I'm actually going to take it over and press it because that's gonna set all these seams for me so I won't have to individually do that when I'm pressing my block. And now we're going to trim it in half horizontally and then we're gonna trim on where the drawn lines were. And my block is 8.5, so half of that's gonna be 4 1/4. So instead of moving my fabric at this point, I'm just going to reline up my ruler with my 4 1/4. So we've made those two cuts. Now we're gonna cut diagonally right down the middle of those blocks where the drawn line was. I can't see my line anymore, but I can see my seams. And so I'm just trimming right down the middle. And for this one, I'm actually going to turn my mat so it's easier for me. And now we've got 8 half square triangles ready to go. So I'm going to press all of these to the dark and I just set them all right there, grab my iron, and then I can just start pressing. If you didn't pre-press, you just want to set your seams like that, and then we're just going to lift them back towards the dark fabric. You can also press these open if you like. Once I get kind of a pile going where I don't feel like I'm getting a good press, I will move those. And by the way, this is just a DIY ironing board I made. I do have a tutorial on how to make this on my channel. I make a much larger one. This is a small one I just recently made for my videos. All right, here we go. And now we just need to trim these up. And these are gonna get trimmed down to 3.5 inches. And here are my 3.5 inch marks. So as you can see, you've got a little bit of leeway on the outside of these so that you can make sure these are totally accurate. And what I like to do is line this diagonal line up on my ruler right along that seam, and then that way you know you're gonna be getting a perfect half square triangle. So I will trim 2 sides just like that, turn it around, line up my 3.5 inch marks again, and voila, I have a perfect half square triangle. So I'm gonna repeat that process for all of these blocks. All right, next we're going to take 4 of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to take 4 of our A squares, set the others aside, and then we're going to sew 4 pieces that look just like this, with a half square triangle, an A square, and a half square triangle. And make sure that they're going the right way so that your star tips look like this. We're just going to sew these together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to press them towards the A fabric because this one doesn't have any seams, so it'll lay a lot flatter. You can also press these open if you like. So I'm just going to bring this entire stack over to my sewing machine and get sewing. So I'm just going to set this stack aside, and I'm just going to be working with this stack first. You can pin these if you like. I'm not going to do that, but you're welcome to pin. And then we're just going to sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I do have my 1/4 inch tape on my machine here, so you can see that my fabric is lined up with this black line, and the red line is where my needle is hitting. I'm just going to go ahead and chain piece these, meaning I'm not cutting my thread in between, so I'm just sewing them all at once. Now I'm just going to pull these all back down and open them up and add my other piece to the other side. So I'm still not cutting them at all. I've just got a little strip of fabric to work with here. It's fast, it's easy, and it definitely saves time. Just make sure that when you're putting on this other star point, you aren't twisting them around. Now we can just carefully cut these pieces apart. And I'm just pressing them again, like I said, towards this center. So here are our finished star points, so we can just set those aside. Our next step is going to be to prepare the center, and our center is going to be using our D squares, 4 more of our A squares, set the rest aside, and 1 of our F squares. Now the rest of these F squares are actually going to be used in the entire quilt, so I can go ahead and set these aside. For now, I just want to show you how to cut it out of your layer cake piece. So those will be used in a different square, so we just need 1. And now we're going to lay these out in a 9 patch, just like this. So the A's are going to go in the corners, the D's are going to go in between, and then our F in the middle. Now we're just going to sew these 3 rows together and sew those rows together, all using a 1/4 inch seam. I like to chain piece, so I'm going to flip this center row down on top of our first row, sew all of this, and then I'll add these, and I'm just going to again do this all over at my machine. So here is our 9 patch so far. I'm going to press all of my rows towards my green fabric. That's going to make not only our rows nest nicely, but I'm also going to spin the seams on these. I've been doing that a lot lately, and I really like how it looks, and I really think that it makes those intersections just so crisp and clean. And it also helps reduce bulk at the intersections as well. All right, now we can fold this one down on top of the middle, and then as you can see right here, we've got 1 seam going to the right, 1 seam going to the left, and they're just butted right up next to each other. We can pin right at that intersection and do the same thing at this intersection. If you'd like, you can cut the little thread that's holding them together. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and do that. I'm just cutting the little thread that held these together because we chain pieced. That'll make it a little bit easier when we go to spin our seams. So I'm going to go ahead and just sew 1/4 inch, and then I'll come back and add our bottom strip. All right, and here we are. And now we're going to spin our seams, and spinning our seams just means we're going to create little 4 patches right here at all of these intersections. It's going to help reduce our bulk. If we were to just press to one side, you have these 2 layers of fabric, you've got the 2 from this seam, and you've got this one. So you've got actually 5 pieces or layers of fabric just all coming together right here. That's kind of a lot. I've done it on a lot of quilts before. It's totally okay, but I've been doing this recently and I really like this technique, so I wanted to share it with you. So to spin your seams, you're going to have all your seams around a certain point going in clockwise or counterclockwise. So all these seams need to be going like this, clockwise for this one. And how I like to do it is just pull my finger around. So this one goes to the right, this one goes down, this one goes across, and this one goes up. That means that these seams right here in the middle are going to have to kind of come apart. Now if you've chained piece, you'll have a little thread there you have to clip. You saw me clip that earlier. There might also be one more little thread in there that you need to pick out. And what you're essentially doing is just picking out the threads that were holding these together. You're not picking into this stitch line or this stitch line or either of these, and so your stitch line should be secure. And you're going to just finger press that at first. We're going to just do all these and then I'll come back and press with the iron. And let's do a close-up of this second one. So here we are on our second one. All of these are going counterclockwise, so that means we need to go to the left, down, right, and up. And just by pressing with your fingers, you'll see that this seam just pretty much pops right apart. You can see there's one little thread in there, and you can grab your seam ripper, or in my case, these little scissors, and just kind of pull that thread out. But as you can see, it really makes a nice distribution of fabric right there. So I'm going to do that to the other two. So these are going clockwise, so down, across, and up. And again, just pull these apart with your fingers. They should come right apart. These are going counterclockwise, just like that. Okay, and now we just need to give this a press. And there you can see those seams look great. And then if we flip it over on the front, give it another press over here. And then here's what our back side looks like, and here's what our front side looks like. Okay, so that turned out great. We're going to set this aside just for a second, and we're going to take our C squares, and we're going to trim these in half diagonally. So I just like to put them right here on my cutting board like this, and then I will take my ruler, and there is a diagonal line on your ruler. You can line that up with one of the straight edges of your square, and then just trim these in half, corner to corner. Super easy. And this is one of the reasons why I encouraged you to use Mary Ellen's Best Press for these. These edges are now cut on the bias, and that's going to make them a little extra stretchy. So next we're going to take these C pieces, and we're going to sew them onto our D squares, and we're just going to center them. You can fold them in half if you want to find the center point and be super accurate, and then fold this in half and then line those up. I gave you a lot of wiggle room on this. There's about a 1/2 inch wiggle room, so I'm not going to worry about it. So I'm just going to eyeball it so that they look like they're centered. And just pin those in place. And then we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and just sew using 1/4 inch to attach these to the sides. And I know this looks a little bit wonky, but it's going to be really cool when we're done. Now we can just take this to the machine and sew on all 4 edges. And when I'm doing this, I usually start just a hair outside of where this piece starts so that my stitch is going to go over the top of it. And likewise, I sew just past it as well. So you can kind of see on there that I just start before it and sew just a little bit past it. And now we can just set those seams and just press these back. So here's what our block is looking like. We're just going to take that and turn it 45 degrees. And now we've got a cross block. And now we need to trim this down to 9.5 inches square. And since I don't have a 9.5 inch ruler, I'm going to use this one. Here's my 9.5 inch line, and here's my 9.5 inch line. And what you're going to want to do is center this in that 9.5 inches. And what I found is about a 1/2 inch on each of these points. So I just try and arrange my ruler so that the 1/2 inch mark hits all of these points. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect. And that looks pretty good. And as you can see, I'm kind of chopping off like a weird amount out here on the edge, but it's all going to look really cool when we're done. Now, instead of moving my fabric at this point, I'm actually just going to rotate my entire cutting mat. That'll keep everything nice and straight. And now I can line up my 9.5 inch lines on here. Again, I just double check twice, cut once, and then I can trim off the remaining fabric. And here we have our finished center block. Now at the beginning of this video, when I cut my green fabric, those were my E squares, but I have actually cut all of my pieces out for my entire quilt. So I'm going to pick 2 E squares that are of a different color, and they should be 2.5 inches square. On the wrong side of the E squares, we are going to be drawing a line, diagonal line, corner to corner. Now I'm going to go ahead and draw the line so it looks like this. I'm not going to do the rest of these because I have my 1/4 inch tape on my machine. Then we're going to take an A square and our E square and place that right side down just like this, and we're just going to sew right on that edge, and then we're going to trim it, and when we flip it up we'll have a snowballed corner, and these are going to be our corner units, and we're going to need 4 of those. So I'm going to just bring all of these over to my machine and sew them all at once. Now I'm actually sewing a scant 1/4 inch here, which means I'm sewing just a hair to the outside of this line, like I'm sewing right next to the line. That's just going to give us a little bit of extra wiggle room when we press this fabric back. It will account for the thread and the fabric. And then we're going to trim 1/4 inch away from our seam line. If you're brave, you can stack them all up and do them together. This doesn't have to be exactly perfect because these are in your seam allowance. Now we can just set these seams, and then I'm going to go ahead and just press these back, but you can always press them open if you prefer. Okay, so here are our 4 corner pieces, and now we just need to assemble our block. So we're going to grab our center, we're going to grab our 4 corners, and we're just going to make sure that the colored portions are pointing out away from the block. And then we can grab our side pieces, and again, just make sure that these are going the correct direction. Just like this. Just make sure you don't accidentally, you know, be an interesting looking block, I guess. But we are going to sew top row together, middle row together, bottom row together, and then sew those all together, and we'll be done with our block. Now in order to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and fold this right side down onto this one. Same here, and same here. I'm going to sew these at my machine, and then I'll come back and add these on. And then we just need to press these. You can press these open if you like, or you can press to one direction. My outside pieces are going to be easier going out because there's no seam, so I'll just press the inside ones in as long as it's not too big of a deal. Can almost not fit it on this board. So I'm going to go ahead and pin at these intersections just so I can keep everything nice and straight. And do the same thing to this one. All right, now we can take this to our sewing machine and sew down both of these edges using a 1/4 inch seam, trim our block, and we'll be all done. And here we have our finished block. This block finishes at 15.5 by 15.5, so it's a really good size block. And you got all of this out of 3 pieces of layer cake. So as you can see, that block was really fun and easy to put together, and it's perfect for your layer cake squares. Now I used 36 layer cake pieces, made 16 quilt blocks, and put them together in this beautiful quilt that you see hanging behind me. I did grab this fabric right here. This is actually from her Dwell line, and it matches perfectly the Nantucket Summer line. And so this is what I used for that low volume border that you see around the outside edges of the quilt there. So I thought that was a really nice, soft kind of touch. And then for my binding, I'm going to be using this print. This was the navy small flower print from the Nantucket Summer line. And then for the backing, I am using this cream colored with the light plaid kind of stripes. So I think that'll be really cute for the backing and binding. I haven't had a chance to do that yet, get that put on my long arm and quilt it. If I do, I will go ahead and put some video in here of me quilting it and what it's going to be looking like finished. This pattern finishes at 77 by 77 if you finish it the way I did. I did put some sashing between all of my blocks. It's just 2-inch sashing, so it finishes at 1.5 inch. I thought it was really kind of a cute touch, so it really made those larger blocks stand out, and then it also created a really cute little kind of churn dash block in between. So I love it when you put quilt blocks together and then there's a secondary design that comes forward like that. For the background fabric on this, I used a gray cross fabric. It is a B Basics background by Lori Holt, I believe is what it's called. It's a really nice neutral print, but I think it just gives it a little bit extra than just a plain white background. If you would like to make this entire quilt pattern, there is a link below this video on where you can get the pattern. You can also go to my store at store.confessionsofahomeschooler.com and search Lucky Layer Cake, and the entire pattern should come up for you. That is going to be it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to thumbs up and subscribe. You can also hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any upcoming fun. Thank you for joining me for today's video, and I will see you next time. This pattern is perfect for layer cakes. You use very struggles. Hopefully you didn't just hear Jason call me E-money in my video.
Huh?
I just heard Dad say E-money. Is that what he said?
Yeah.
Okay, well, so did everyone. I'll go. Love you. There's hard-boiled eggs out there if you want to eat one, and I already made some egg salad so we can put it on bread for lunch. I know. So I had them for breakfast, and then I made some egg salads in the fridge. We'll
Is that what that was?
eat that for lunch.
But now it's old.
No, it's not. I made it this morning.
We don't even
I
have
feel
bread.
like making it this morning is fresh.
We'll have bread.
There's no bread of any kind in
I
there?
didn't see-
Throw it on a bagel. I'm sure there's some bread in there.
I don't really do
Tortilla?
that. What?
I don't know. Can I finish filming and then I'll come help you with lunch? Thank you.
That was good week.
Go. Thank you. I did grab some of this fabric right, Jaxie. And it's just a really nice neutral, but it gives it, Jax. Okay, I won't say that. Cut that part out. Okay. All right, that's it. The Lucky Layer Cake. Do I need to re-say that? Over to this side, because you can see it better.